So you think they were humans, these ancient civilizations? You don't think they were aliens?
They were civilizations connected back to the very origins of who we once were. More of a sacred side of our history and what we used to be.
I would love that, to see more advanced beings before us. That's exciting, you know?
We seem to have a chapter where there were other types of even hominids on the earth.
All right, guys, Matt is back on set today. It's been a while, my friend.
Yeah, it's good to see you and talk to you again, Sean.
Yeah, welcome back. You've traveled the world since we last spoke.
It's been exciting. We have had some amazing adventures, Turkey and Peru, and we're exploring other areas too. That we have upcoming trips to like Menorca, Spain, and Bolivia, and others. And it's been really amazing getting to places that I've researched for so much of my life, decades. To be able to get on the ground and finally see them in person and do a lot of analysis and bring experts in to look at them.
Absolutely. So Turkey and Peru, are those signs of the oldest civilizations that we know?
Well, I mean, there's other areas as well, like obviously like parts of Egypt and Baalbek, Lebanon, and India and China, but really the focus of these areas of Turkey, and not the area that's been discussed a lot lately, like for instance, Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe is getting a lot of attention. I'm focused more on an area that's actually quite unknown still to the world. Areas in eastern Turkey around Lake Van that are brand new sites. Some of the discoveries that we can talk about are as new as 5 years ago, a year ago, 2017. So just within the last few years are new archaeological discoveries that are going to shake up the entire establishment in the world.
Wow. So what came to light, I guess, over there 5 years ago?
Well, so back, the first one, I guess in 2017 that really opened a lot of this up was they discovered underwater ruins under Lake Van that, by the way, it's the only megalithic underwater ruins in the world. Now, there are underwater shallow ruins in some places underwater, like off of Egypt and Greece. But what we're talking about are large megalithic structures that are very deep underneath Lake Van. In fact, the depth of them is what makes this so interesting. They're 75 feet underwater.
Damn.
And it was only discovered in 2017 by a photographer that took a group down to uncover them. And these ruins cover a kilometer in area, massive. And there's a flower of life carved into these giant basalt blocks that are from what we're exploring as being an ancient civilization that may predate a lot of things that are established even for what academics are considering for the region.
Wow, that is so fascinating. So that must be hard to explore though, because you got to scuba dive, right?
We're going to be, one of the focuses of the upcoming documentary that I'm leading with experts around the world is to dive down and analyze and explore those ruins because of also the connections that they may have with things that are nearby above water that have the same type of stone, the same geology, the same stonework, the same symbols of these, what I believe are much, much older lost civilizations from an entire forgotten chapter of our history that has largely been forgotten and mixed in with more recent civilizations that may give us a completely different understanding of who we are and the connections we once had with the ancient world.
Wow. You might have discovered Atlantis.
Well, it's got parallels to that because of, again, the connections around the world to, is Atlantis just like this global civilization that is a name that's more about a connection around the world that something had? Because that's really what we're exploring, is that Atlantis might not have been even just one location. It's more of like an entire civilization that spanned around the world.
Wow, that could be an interesting idea, right?
Yeah, well, that's the idea, is that you see similarities off of even places like the Yucatan of Mexico and some of the structures there with parallels across the world. So we're looking at basically in my perception and looking at the evidence, is an entire chapter of human history that's been largely forgotten. But was this not from the lens of a primitive culture, like a nomadic hunter-gatherer group that had, flint and steel and just like was traveling around hunting large game and moving on and having small settlements, but literally a chapter of human civilization where we built the most incredible stone temples and pyramids around the world, and that culture reached high levels.
Shout out to today's sponsor, Prolon. If starting the year with a fast feels a little daunting, you're not alone. There's an entire community of individuals wanting to make a meaningful decision in their health, just like you. This is what makes group fasting so powerful and why I'm joining in on Prolon's January Longevity Challenge, which is a coach-led program to set you up for fasting success. Prolon's fasting mimicking diet is a revolutionary plant-based nutrition program that nourishes the body while making cells believe they're fasting. I got all 5 boxes here and I'm starting day 1 tomorrow. It's researched and developed for decades at USC's Longevity Institute and backed by leading US medical centers. It helps promote healthy blood sugar, enhanced skin appearance, fat loss, and improved energy and focus. It all starts with their 5-day program, which contains snacks, soups, and beverages designed to keep the body in a fasting state. No guesswork or planning required, which is a relief after a busy holiday. If you guys are ready to make 2025 your healthiest year yet, order your Prolon 5-day kit at prolonlife.com/DSH. And they're offering Digital Social Hour listeners 15% off their 5-day nutrition program. Use the code DSH at prolonlife.com/DSH.
Sophistication before it was completely destroyed by catastrophes that basically wiped them out, and it had the memory of what we used to be largely forgotten.
Right. So you think they were humans, these ancient civilizations? You don't think they were aliens?
No, I think that they were civilizations connected back to the very origins of who we once were, back to more of a sacred side of our history and what we used to be.
Right. I would love that to see more advanced beings before us. That's exciting, you know?
Yeah, exactly. We seem to have a chapter where there were other types of even hominids on the earth. Hominids that, for instance, had larger skulls. We're looking at different skulls from around the world, places like Malta and Paracas, Peru, and Tiwanaku, and even areas around the Black Sea where there may have been a different kind of human, like a genetically unique type of human that we don't share the same comparisons today in that way.
Those are what I remember from history class in school. Those caveman type humans, right, with the elongated skulls.
Well, and I think the one of the conceptions is that, like, we think of like Neanderthals, right?
Yeah.
As a group that was a very primitive group that came before, but what we're looking at is a chapter that may have coexisted with them at the same time, but is not from like a primitive lens. We may have had different hominid groups here that were as sophisticated as we are, if not more, that actually died out. And then the remnants of them was like just a forgotten memory. We had even aspects of other genetic differences in places of the world where there may be even smaller humans and some larger humans. Like, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that during Magellan's sailing around the world, when he was circumnavigating the planet, when he was in Patagonia down off South America, and it's well established in his records when his journal entries with the group that he was sailing with, is that they encountered people off of Patagonia that were over 10 feet tall.
Whoa, giants.
Yeah, and they actually were they had to leave because they were basically scared away by this group that were somewhat violent in some means. But the whole concept that's fascinating is there an entire chapter of our story where there were humans that lived longer, were taller, had larger brains in some ways, larger heads. We're finding evidence of that all around the world, and it seems that, and I believe that this idea of cranial and binding, we see like in Africa and other places, may have been just a means of mimicking someone that used to actually exist in a genetic way, not something where they altered their skull size. So
that's the Anunnaki you're talking about, right?
Well, it may have ties back to that, is this whole idea that, like we see with Diodorus and Solon, they discuss this whole idea of like almost like a demigod type of race that existed during Atlantis in this time period where there were almost like half human, half gods that, lived enormous amounts of time. We see that with Enoch. We see that with the whole Noah figure, Zaya Sudra. This concept of human beings living for enormous amounts of time and having this whole chapter that we used to have that we don't understand anymore. That's become almost like a fairy tale and a mystery to us.
Right.
I'll give you an example, like places like, for instance, Troy is discussed in the Iliad and others, right, by Homer. And it was this idea, this concept of of civilizations and Greek myths and different cities that weren't real. And yet in the 1800s, they found Troy in Western Turkey. And that's the same thing we're seeing with places like Eridu and Shuruppak in modern day Mesopotamia, places that were supposed to be a myth, that were not supposed to be real, end up being found. And then it makes us have to reevaluate our entire understanding of history.
Wow, that is nuts. Why do you think a lot of this history gets forgotten? Do you think there's some foul play there?
Well, there's a there's a combination of a couple of things going on, I believe. Number one, we have to look at these time periods that have enormous amounts of time in between them. You know, the civilizations that we're looking at and finding evidence around the world, you know, working with experts, looking at different places where the civilizations may have disappeared, 12,000 years ago. Look at all human beings have done the last 500 to 600 years. So we were basically thrown back into the Middle Ages that long ago. And yet we're talking about not even 1,000 years. Now imagine civilizations that have been gone for 12,000 years. What would be left from them? How much would we understand of them? And how much of that would just turn into a myth and something that we would almost believe wasn't true any longer?
Right. It's like that game Telephone we played growing up.
No, exactly, right? Like someone starts by telling a story, and by the time it gets to the end, it's completely different than where it started.
100%. Yeah, but that was before you could just document stuff. Now I feel like the history we're living present day, I feel like they'll retain it better, right?
Well, I don't know about that.
Really?
I mean, what would actually survive us if, say, 2,000 years went by after destruction? If we had a massive CME event, coronal mass ejection event, something beyond our comprehension in modern history, but something we're seeing evidence of, during the geomagnetic incursion back 12,000 years ago, what would be left of us after 2,000 years of basically wiping out civilization? We think about how we build with either wood or glass or metal. Yeah. Those things would just erode and disappear. Digital records that we have most of things kept, paper, 500 to 1,000 years in the best of conditions.
Really?
So you have to imagine, think about what we have in our world. What would actually survive us?
Wow.
What would be remembered from us in 2,000 years? Would they even know that we existed? Think about what would survive. The only thing that really survives the test of time like that is incredibly precise and hard stonework. The types of stone like granite and basalt and other stone that is extremely hard. Yeah, that things that would last the test of time. And here we have this telltale evidence around the world of them building out of those things. And yet we look at the lens of them being primitive.
Wow.
But they have the things left over that have survived the test of time.
That's a great point. We haven't built anything like that in our generation.
No, what would be left of us?
We built skyscrapers, but those would just collapse probably.
Glass and metal. Things would just corrode and break away. I think what we need to do is wrap our heads around how much time like 2,000 or 3,000 years is. Now imagine 12,000 years since they existed and what would actually be left of them. And to be honest, I mean, if we look around the world at what is left, it's rather impressive compared to what may be left from us.
Right.
That's why we have to look at this lens in a different way of saying, look at this entire lost civilization that has evidence all around the world, whether or not we go to like Tonga, the Mariana Islands, with these huge pillars that the local indigenous groups have no idea who built them. They say Maui built them. And is that evidence of like an ancient Lemurian Mu connection, just like we see with Atlantis? The remnants of the echoes of a long civilization that's been gone for thousands and thousands of years. And even the indigenous people that live there say, we're not the ones who built them. Yep. There was someone here before us, someone who is highly sophisticated and spiritually inclined and more connected and built things in a way that we don't build things anymore. It's like a forgotten idea of who we once were.
Yeah. You think there's any lineage that survived from those ancient times, or do you think completely wiped out everyone?
It's interesting when we look at secret societies around the world and throughout history. Secret societies that are sort of hiding in the shadows at times. And I think that those are potentially connected back, at least they believe they are, to certain bloodlines that go all the way back to these original groups and these people. Now, does that mean some kind of like a superiority? No, I don't think so at all. I believe that they think that there's certain connections that still exist with those groups.
Yeah, you're talking like the Illuminati and stuff.
Right.
I never even wondered, how old those go back, but that could be true.
Well, there's
sure.
old families like the Rothschilds and others that seemed in the Sinclairs and others that, state or believe that they have connections back to a much more ancient lineage. I mean, we see other destructive figures throughout history and empires who have literally believed that enough to fight entire wars and conquer other nations. And it's a history that I think we're fighting over the scraps of trying to remember this legacy of a grand civilization that was in many ways more sophisticated in some aspects than we were. Their understanding, like look at the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's built to be a perfect half ratio of our entire Earth. That's created the three pyramids created to be this mimicking of the relationship between our Earth, the sun, and the moon, but also the constellation of the three belt stars of Orion. And that gets into the Hermetic laws, the constants that are basically ancient Egyptian and Greek knowledge of these laws that exist in the universe and on Earth, that if you adhere to them, you can create some kind of a synergy between like creating structures here on Earth that almost bridge that heaven on earth connection, right? As above, so below, as within, so without. That's the ancient Hermetic law of correspondence that these civilizations seem to adhere to with why they built in very specific places.
Yeah, because the architecture itself is impressive, but the fact that you mentioned all that too on top of it's like these guys were way more advanced than we can even fathom.
Yeah, they were building in a way that it's not random at all. They were going to very specific parts of the earth. It's a term called geodesy. It refers to building in very specific spots and aligning to cardinal points and magnetic points and ley lines in which you can create this synergy between the magnetic fields of the earth and star constellations and our connection between the sun, earth, and the moon, which seem to have a relationship with the whole. It's basically this idea that you can create a cosmic connection. And when you do that, you can unlock these secret abilities of humans and abilities here that we have, almost like magic.
Right. So is this where you start to lose the traditional archaeologists? Is this where that divide starts?
Yeah, I think that one of the big disconnects between archaeology today, and I'm working with archaeologists on this project in the work that we're doing, but one of the biggest disconnects has been this idea that they look at it through a completely physical lens. Like if you're an archaeologist and you're trying to understand these ancient temples aligned to energetic ley lines and magnetic fields and aspects of our sun, earth, moon, and the constellations, if you don't understand the metaphysical spiritual realms, how are you going to understand why they built things they did the way they are? How are you going to understand the energetic nature of why they did things?
Right. That's important. But they're so logical that it has to be like a fact or like evidence-based, right?
Well, it's just because I think that the academic world has too many divisions within it. Too many divisions between the metaphysical understanding of reality and the physical understanding of reality. We have to come at this through the lens of like an esoteric mind. We have to combine philosophy, science, and the metaphysical side of nature to understand why these civilizations did what they did.
Right.
And once we do that, I think the danger, Sean, and why these conversations haven't moved forward in the right way is that to this day we're still taught in school that consciousness is simply derived from the brain.
Right.
And it's something where we get intelligent enough and consciousness develops through the brain and we die and that's it. Our existence just disappears into nothing. But that doesn't seem to be the case at all. In fact, the ancients around the world believe something very, very different, and not like the primitive ancients, but for instance, like ancient Egyptians, these subterranean places like the Osirion and the Serapeum, where they built these very mysterious giant granite boxes over 100 tons no one was buried inside them. What was their purpose? Was this some kind of a chamber for like an incarnation chamber or some kind of rejuvenation chamber? The ancient Egyptians believed that if somebody died, they could somehow bring them back through the reincarnation cycle to have them live again.
Mm.
It really, what it tells us, Sean, is that we are actually eternal beings
Wow.
that never truly die. We just go through cycles of living each life and then come back through karmic laws and learning new things to grow and ascend as a metaphysical, spiritual being that's having a physical experience here, not the other way around.
That is fascinating. So the Egyptians were trying to control the reincarnation cycle,
That's
basically?
exactly.
That's cool.
And they believed that if a soul was a person and through their soul was given the right journey, that they could cycle back and find their way back again.
Whoa.
Right? So if the idea was this, that if somebody dies that was really important to them,
Yeah.
right? An ancient bloodline of some kind of a king that was connected to the divine, some kind of a demigod or something, that if they put them through a process through their death of certain rituals, certain metaphysical rituals and physical rituals, that they could allow that soul to travel through the stars of Orion and make their way back and then incarnate again as a child that they could track and trace through that journey, and then they could have them back again as a leader, as a ruler.
That is crazy. And they pulled that off? Has there been documentation on that?
What's wild is there's what's called the Egyptian king list that matches the Sumerian king list. And a lot of people don't talk about the Egyptian king list, but one of the things that's on it, and we find that through Edfu, ancient sites like that, the Temple of Horus, is that this king list includes kings that were existing before dynastic Egyptians that had reigns of hundreds and hundreds of years. But what we find is that the rulers that came later lived much shorter lifespans. Like there was an entire different chapter.
Yeah.
When those, again, like almost like a demigod type of ruler that could live for hundreds of years and reigned and ruled, and those are well established in those kings lists.
Interesting. So they were just using the same name, but he would just be in different bodies basically for hundreds of years?
Yeah, like they would say something like Osiris the first or the second, or Ramses the first or the second. It would be like they were tracing these lineages of different beings that. Are they just the incarnation of a previous one that lived, and then they kept, passing down through? It's really mysterious, but they're not the only group that was mapping the underworld, as they call it, the spiritual realm. The Egyptians were doing it, and especially the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians. And there's other groups as well, like the Greeks. I mean, the story of Charon, right? The boatman, the ferryman, where you go into the underworld and you can pass into to the underworld of souls. We see that story first echoed through like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh goes to seek the flood hero Ziusudra to seek immortality, and he has to pass through the underworld to get there.
Crazy.
They didn't just believe this. It was their foundation of understanding. They wrote about it in nearly everything. Like, for instance, one of the most famous of the ancient Sumerian myths and tablets is called the Descent of Inanna, in which Inanna, one of these ancient goddesses, descends down to go find Dumuzi, one of her lovers that died and was in the underworld, and has to go and try to seek him and find him again.
Whoa.
It's wild, and we see it echoed through so much of our media and movies. But it's actually has a basis in ancient mythology that the underworld and the spiritual realms play very, very pivotal aspects of our reality. But because of the limitations of our five senses, we really lack an understanding of the totality of what reality really encompasses.
Yeah, that is so cool. Now people have such a different perception of death. I wonder when that change happened.
Well, I mean, think about it. If you're told that death is the end and that you should fear death, like the church has done, after the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, if you inflict that kind of mentality in, you can literally control a person entirely. The fear-based systems like that are how you control someone, because then if they fear their own mortality, they're not going to take as many chances in life.
Wow.
They're not going to really seek something higher because they're going to be worried about the more primitive aspects of life, right? How do I stay alive? How do I survive? I'm living in fear. I'm going to stay in a small mindset box.
That's so true, though.
Well, that fear is powerful.
Yeah.
Fear has controlled humanity for thousands of years. It's a powerful tool. And one of the ways that fear controls us is through the idea of death and the false knowledge of what we really are and how these cycles all play in. If Sean Kelly like knows that he's gonna incarnate again in the next life, what does that do to your fear levels or your understanding of reality?
Right, I would take way more chances.
And you would also probably want to leave, like you are, leaving a legacy of something, right?
Yeah.
That you may not do if you were thinking, wow, I need to try to consume whatever resources I can because I'm never going to be back ever again, right?
Yeah. That's so spot on. I used to fear death as a kid, dude, even like 8 years old. Like I remember being in elementary, like, oh, I don't want to die,
It limits everything. It limits our, it's like there's a lock that ties that hooks around us and prevents us from opening up our mind and seeing the greater reality that exists all around us.
Yeah.
And I highly encourage people to study things like Hermeticism to really understand. Like, for instance, one of the things that people may not know is that one of Isaac Newton's most important esoteric things that he studied before all of his theories was what's called the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. It's a Hermetic tablet, not the same as the Emerald Tablets out of Thoth in Egypt. The Hermetic, the Emerald Tablet is ancient Hermetic knowledge of philosophy and alchemy.
Wow.
And it ties into what are called natural law or cosmic laws, which is what I brought up before as the idea of it's called the law of correspondence. As above, so below, as within, so without. It's this idea that everything in the cosmos is connected, and that what's reflected in the universe and out in the cosmos is reflected here on Earth. And that the Earth has a synergy that it plays out through humanity on a great stage. Like Shakespeare said, right? All of the world is a stage. We're all playing roles within that.
Simulation theory, right?
Yeah, that we're part of something far greater than most of us understand. And that we're on a great stage of experience. And that what happens within humanity through the archetypes of humanity is basically being played out in the entire universe.
Yeah, that is nuts. Yeah, you've studied a lot of these ancient texts, right?
Yeah. Yeah, my favorite, again, all the different Hermetic texts I would highly encourage because it's based on ancient Egyptian and Greek knowledge. Again, like the Emerald Tablet, the vision of Hermes, right? I highly recommend all the Hermetic texts that they've woven down through that, as well as things like the Book of Enoch, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, right? The Book of John, the Secret Book of John. They all are these forbidden texts, ancient Gnostic texts and ancient pre-Hebrew and Hebrew texts, and all the way back to ancient Sumerian texts from the tablets that all discuss these esoteric and mysterious aspects of spirit and alchemy, and how really the path of the human journey here, the hero's journey, is about the alchemical transformation of our physical experience here into a spiritual metaphysical experience, and that it's an alchemical experience because we start as spirit. We come from spirit as a higher place, and we go through a circle. Everything is all about circles, okay? It's never time, and the linear aspects that we're told are actually very false. Everything is more of a giant circle.
Wow.
There's no beginning and there's no end. Just like our experience here is about starting somewhere and then circling back to where we started. It just because it's an endless amount of loops and cycles that continues. And it seems to be based on these aspects of Earth, the sun, the moon, going through cycles of influences of our galactic center, influences of the planets, maybe even influences in the outer solar system that relate to cycles of consciousness based on what's called the precession of the equinox or the great year. Are you familiar with that?
No, what is that?
So the Earth has a tilt or a wobble to it. So when it spins on its axis, it actually has a tilt to it. And the tilt is based on what's called the precession of the equinox. And what it means is as the Earth rotates, it actually faces specific star constellations for intervals of 2,100 years. And the entire cycle that the Earth rotates around facing different constellations is what's called the Great Year. And it's made up of, again, the 12 zodiacs. It's the 12 different constellations that the Earth faces during certain intervals that seem to be a pivotal part of why human beings go through these cycles.
Wow.
So, right, like cycles of like the lost civilizations, like we talked about, right? Building pyramids and temples and being connected to a super metaphysical, spiritual side, and then being knocked back again. And then going through a warlike period of conquering and being more primitive before cycling back again to reach more conscious periods. It basically mimics these cycles of the Great Year.
Dang.
They're called the Yuga cycles out of India.
That is fascinating. So go on.
Well, they're related to the idea that we go through things like Iron and Bronze ages and Silver ages and then Golden ages. And that those cycles are actually predetermined and governed. And I mean, we can talk about why those are governed and who governs them.
Absolutely.
But we seem to be part of a much greater type of system here of cycles that are governed through exterior forces, in which we are more like actors that are in a great play that are going through these cycles. And that's what leads to the rise and fall of consciousness, and also leads to us being warlike or wanting to seek higher esoteric places.
So cool. So what cycle are we in right now? And then we'll get to who's running these.
Well, look at what's going on with the sun. The sun is having these massive aurora borealis events, these influences of greater energy that seems to be hitting us. And that seems to also be playing a role, just like the ancients times did, where the sun activity may be playing a part in these zodiac changes with consciousness. All these energy blasts the earth. We all of a sudden kind of just like wake up from a slumber. And we're like, wait, what are we doing right now? Why are we doing all these very materialistic, kind of fear-based, war-based things? And as those cycles transition, we all of a sudden as a species change into something else. It's like a transformation, like a phoenix transformation. Out of the ashes from what we were, we all of a sudden blossom like a flower into something new. And those cycles seem to be governed from an ancient place.
Really?
Yeah.
So some would call it God, right?
Well, again, I go back to ancient Hermeticism, and I would highly encourage people to study something like the Vision of Hermes. It describes how there is an archetype at the very top, an architect, like an ancient architect, who some would call God. And it describes how it was like this perfect creation of the universe. But that there was what's called the second mind that was created in order to foster all aspects of creation within that and balance all cycles. So all cycles within that are actually essentially governed. Now, in the Nag Hammadi, it calls them the archons, basically the rulers of reality. And then I think that the term that might make people more familiar to some, for instance, the ancient Sumerians called them the Anuna. The Akkadians and Assyrians called them the Anunnaki. And then if we look in Hebrew times, they're called the Elohim. And ancient Egypt, they're called the Natiru. It's basically like the ancient gods. And they're the ones who are described as being the ones that foster and balance all cycles here. Wow. And that humanity is a product of those cycles and that governing, so that it's like some kind of a grand story playing out.
Yeah.
So we think of it as humanity being in charge of its own destiny, but really where it comes down to is there's a fine line between free will and destiny that seems to play into this. And that destiny seems to play a very big role. As in that the governing aspect of our reality in the ancient times is coming from something that is more mysterious and more powerful than we really understand.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in, because as humans, you want to have free will, right? But it seems like there's some really big destiny behind things.
Well, it's like a two-part process, is that we're given free will to make our own choices. But once we walk a certain path and we start following things like intuition and the higher guidance and start becoming more connected, something unlocks in us. It's like all of a sudden we become something different. Wow. We become part of something different. And that's where it describes as, it's like radio stations. It's like a word antenna that basically tunes in to something else. And all of a sudden we become part of like a different story.
That is crazy, dude. Wow. You're really uncovering a lot.
Well, and that's why we're studying these ancient sites around the world, because how it all ties back is that areas that I am particularly focused on, like in Eastern Turkey around Lake Van, we have ancient temples and sites that the world hasn't even heard of yet. Places like Ionis and Kefkalesi, Şavuz Tepe, Toprikali, Azfrina Tepe, Altın Tepe. And they contain symbols, Sean, ancient motifs and symbols that go and connect to nearly every lost civilization place around the world, like Peru, Bolivia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece. What they have are symbols and artifacts that are coming out that are showing these teachings that seem to go all the way back and connect everything Hermeticism. Like, for instance, if you study these laws and these constants out of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and these others, and you look at the symbols that are left there, you realize that they're all the same. Like there was a lost knowledge of understanding who we are and our greater capacity in the universe and how we can achieve unlocking our greatest aspect of ourselves. And the teachings are laid down in these artifacts and temples left behind for a future time when humanity can finally understand it. One of the wild things is, Sean, that we're finding evidence, like especially Ionis and Kefkalesi, that later civilizations deliberately buried them to try to conceal them and protect them because of the volatile world that they were living in.
Dang. So it seems like there was some sort of takeover, whether it was hostile or
yeah.
I don't know what happened. But.
Well, like I'll give you an example is in these civilizations that I'm studying, that the documentary is focused on, like again, the underwater ruins I just talked about, showing the flower of life and everything, the very pivotal aspect of us understanding the balance of everything and the harmony that exists, is that the cultures that came later seem to incorporate a lot of their knowledge into their cultures. Like the culture that archaeologists believe built all of these is called the Urartu or Urartians. And that the word Urartu just means Ararat, like Mount Ararat. Now, they incorporated a lot of knowledge into their culture. However, the time that they lived, around 3,800 years ago, 3,000 years ago, they were it was a volatile time on the earth. They were in constant war with Mesopotamian civilizations to the south, like the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And so you imagine you're in a warlike world where there's empires conquering each other. There is ancient knowledge in those cultures, but it's also such a volatile time that they're being conquered and burned and destroyed. And so if you knew that you were in a place that had ancient knowledge that was from a much earlier time, a sacred knowledge, you would want to try to protect it, right?
Right.
And so we're seeing evidence that that culture called the Urartians deliberately buried some of these sites in order to preserve and protect them so that someday in the future, cultures that came along that were of a higher consciousness in a more peaceful time could go find them again.
Wow.
And return to the knowledge that we once had. And these regions are very important to ancient cultures around the world. Like, for instance, this area around Lake Van was visited by Alexander the Great and Xerxes and the Knights Templar. The same cross that we see at Ionis is the exact same cross that became the benchmark of the cross for the Knights Templar, as well as the cross that we see in the Vatican.
Holy
today.
Crap.
It's like that knowledge is still preserved in the echelons of secret societies and religions, and they've been fighting over it for thousands of years.
It's like a time capsule.
Right. Like, for instance, look in front of the Vatican. Not only do you have that same cross that we see at Ionis, that's in the Knights Templar, and that's mimicked in the Maltese cross, but you see the pine cone, a giant statue of a pine cone in front of the Vatican. And guess what? The same artifact that I'm talking about from Kefkalesi, it's called the Kefkalesi bas-relief, a giant 3 foot by 3 foot by 4 foot basalt artifact that has all of these symbols, like the first cup and the symbols of the doorways, the triptych doorways that we see around the world, like in the ancient Mayans and Egyptians and in ancient Peru. But not only that, but we see, Sean, the passing of the pine cone in their hand, just like we see in ancient Mesopotamia. It's no coincidence that in front of the Vatican, they have a giant pine cone sitting in front of that. The pine cone of the seeds of knowledge in the pineal gland.
Oh.
The idea of unlocking this greater aspect of consciousness in humanity. And again, like I mentioned, that exact same cross, not the cross used in Christianity, but the cross that's within things like within the Vatican in the royals, and also in the Pope, within the mitre hat and within the cloak that they wear and on the staff and all of that. It shows the same cross as the Knights Templar, but that I believe goes back to Ionis as basically like this ancient knowledge and understanding that became literally fought over around the world and tried to be controlled. So that I think that humanity could forget about its ancient lineage of what they once were so that they could be controlled easier.
Crazy. Have you been to the Vatican?
Not yet.
I heard they gatekeep a lot of stuff there, though.
Definitely. Well, I mean, the Vatican Archives has all of these ancient texts that were taken out of things like Abrahamic religions and the Holy Bible and all these things where chapters, like for instance, the Book of Enoch was completely removed from the original text that it was supposed to be in there from the council. It's called the Council of Nicaea. During the Holy Roman Empire, they basically went through and decided what writings they wanted to keep in and what they wanted to remove and what they wanted to alter. And of course, a lot of people have discussed that on this channel with you.
Yeah.
How there's certain things that have been removed and then kept, but there's been a lot of other things that have been hidden and taken down there because I think that they thought that humanity wasn't ready for it yet.
And that's my biggest problem with the Bible, because I have on a lot of Christians and like even pastors and stuff. But my thing is, that's not the original text.
No, it's definitely not. It's just a collection of much more ancient things.
That's what I'm saying. Like, if you're going to study something, wouldn't you want the original source that's non-biased?
If you want to study things that are in the Bible, in things like Genesis, what you really need to be studying are the much more ancient versions of those. Like, for instance, studying the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh and Eridu Genesis and Myth of Adapa and Legend of Itsubar. These are all Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tablets that predate the Bible by thousands and thousands of years. It's where all those stories originated from.
Wow.
Especially the whole Noah mythos. That, again, if we look at today, there's a very important set of tablets that actually just got translated fully called the Babylonian World Map. And it is the oldest map of the world in existence. And it describes this landing of the Ark up in Mount Ararat and the original ancient world that the Babylonians saw, and basically connects all the things that I'm doing right now in that Ararat region of eastern Turkey that has, again, the cross and the first chalice and the pine cone and this triptych doorway. All of this knowledge that we see around the world seems to originate from a very esoteric and mysterious place. It's where they buried all these sites to try to protect them.
Interesting.
For a future time period.
So Noah's Ark actually happened.
I believe that the story that we see in Genesis in the Bible is a very rewritten version of something that had a very, very significant basis in ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian cultures. And we see that all throughout the tablets. And again, like I mentioned, it gets into very distinct details of a disaster that was coming for the world, of a great flood, not the whole world, but especially for that region, in which there was an ancient king and a priest named Ziusudra, who became the Noah figure, who was warned of this catastrophe by his patron god Enki secretly, because it describes how the Anuna, these ancient gods, had a pact that they weren't supposed to tell humanity, and that they essentially wanted to wipe out the seed of humanity and start over again. And that he was warned of this event and was told to build this large boat out of cedar, a massive one, to bring his family and some animals he had to start and create a new golden age on earth. And that his three sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, would essentially carry on his lineage and create a new world. And what we found that's so fascinating, Sean, is that at these sites around Lake Vaughan that most of the world has never heard of yet, we have kings lists there. Specifically, one of them at Shavus Tepe, that directly mentions the lineage of King Haik and these other rulers that are ancient Armenian rulers that are literally descendants of that lineage of that family. And it shows right in the descendant line that actually was real and it happened.
Crazy.
That the stories, these ancient Hebrew and pre-Hebrew stories were actually real. And that there was a whole chapter of history that was connected to these lost civilizations from these pre-biblical ancient Sumerian Akkadian descendants that were, their task was to essentially create like a new world. And that there was what we call Adapa and the Seven Sages that were traveling around the world creating civilizations.
That is nuts. How many times do you think humanity's been restarted?
From studying things like ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland and really looking at climatic data, but also geologic data, right? I was just in Turkey with famous geologist, Dr. Robert Schock, and we were looking at vitrification evidence on these huge basalt blocks. Vitrification means melting of the stone. Now, in order to get that, you have to have temperatures that exceed 2,000 degrees. And you can only get that in extreme climatic events throughout history, which gives us a benchmark to look at, well, when did these things happen? You know, if these stones were built before these events, it means that they're older than the events occurred, right? And it's giving us a benchmark for how old they could be and when they occurred. And so when we look at this evidence of damage and these evidence of destruction in these places, it shows us that there have been at least one, if not two chapters, at least I believe two chapters of human civilization that have risen up and fallen back again, risen up and then fallen back again. The problem was after the second time, what we call the Younger Dryas around 11,600 years ago when it ended, the division between what's known as the Pleistocene and the Holocene, the time we're in now, it looks like we had, like you just had Graham on, we had a total reset of our species with amnesia where we literally forgot everything because so much time went by in between that we forgot the knowledge of what we once had. And we got knocked back to a more primitive means. And that's why humanity developed, you know, through the Iron and Bronze Age into a very primitive kind of warlike culture because we went a completely different direction.
Wow. Yeah, because there used to be a ton of wars, right? Thousands of years ago.
Well, our civilization went through a completely different path than it once did. And again, I think it gets back into the Yuga cycles, this great year, these different zodiac cycles, is during Pisces. And before we got into this very violent warlike period where consciousness became very low and humanity went through a different path that it once did. But we have to remember that in ancient northern Mesopotamia, southern Turkey, have you heard of the massive underground cities like Derinkuyu?
No.
In southern Turkey, the largest underground cities in the world that have been found, and actually some of them were found by accident within the last 50 years. There was somebody doing excavations in the modern day city of Derinkuyu today. That's above, and it's a funny story actually. There was a farmer that had chickens and he had a small building apartment. It had a corridor between them, and the chickens were disappearing somewhere into a hole. And he was like, his chickens were coming back, and he couldn't figure out where they were going. And so he found a crack that they were slipping through, and he knocked down a wall and entered unintentionally opened up a gateway, a doorway down into the largest underground city in the world called Derinkuyu that has like 25 levels underground that could have housed, they believe could have housed up to 20,000 people underneath them, created in these massive settings that were done in such a way, Sean, that Derinkuyu ended up not being the only underground city in the region they found. There was another city 5.5 miles from it called Kaimakli. And now what's wild about it is that at the very bottom of these underground areas, they're basically like giant corridors that have interconnected levels that then go underground. Like if you were to look at like an ant farm or a worm farm where they have different levels that they're all living in, it was like these giant corridors that were cut into the rock that go down into the earth more than a quarter mile. And they have these giant stones that get rolled in front of the doorway to seal them off. Now, what's wild, though, Sean, is that Derinkuyi's sister city called Kaimakli, instead of people traveling between it above the ground, they created a 5.5 mile tunnel corridor at the very bottom between the cities so that people wouldn't have to go above ground at all. Like it was such a volatile time period above that the civilizations, the only way they were surviving through generations was to go down and secure themselves, bring food and resources. They had evidence of animals that were brought down. They had evidence of schools, evidence of where living quarters, places to prepare food, air shafts. These civilizations were preparing for like the end of the world to survive underneath. And they went to such great lengths that they literally could travel and traverse between underground cities without even having to go above ground.
Wow. How would they pull that off, though? They must have had some technology back then.
We have no idea because none of the rock that they took out of these places has ever been found. They're so ancient that all the evidence for how they built them and what they did is just gone.
Damn. What would you theorize, though, if you had to guess on how they did it?
They used some kind of either ancient machines or tools that we don't know what they are. But they went to such great lengths to create them that they obviously realized that it was of grave importance to the survival of their civilizations. It was an area built in this very soft kind of volcanic porous material that they were able to carve down into. And it's basically right in the center of the ancient world. So think about what I'm talking about with these civilizations around Lake Van in eastern Turkey, and then areas like in western Turkey and then southern Mesopotamia. This region of Turkey is this kind of higher plateau area that's right in the center of all of it. And I can only imagine these ancient cultures all had been aware of a previous cycle of what had happened to them. And so they had created those underground areas to then survive another one. But the scariest part is, Sean, that there's no evidence that they ever came back out.
Whoa.
So, for instance, like, again, the whole idea of species with amnesia is what could have happened to totally reset us. If you have cultures that are carrying knowledge down of their ancient ways and all the knowledge that they once knew, the fact that our civilization didn't take very much of that with us and we got knocked down to a very primitive time means that most of them probably never made it back out.
Damn.
Think about it right now, if we're looking at climatic events over a period of like 1,500 years, periodic climatic events that are far more destructive than anything we've seen in thousands of years here on Earth, thousands of years. Things like nuclear winters from coronal mass ejection events where there's radioactivity, and climatic things that are so severe that ice ages are taking over, and you're getting incredibly volatile time periods where you can't even be on the surface. Imagine them going down there and trying to survive for generations. Entire people, kids being born that never even see the above world, that have to live their entire life underground. And how many generations can go by before, they just never, they never come back out again because they run out of resources and they don't survive. It looks like, I believe that the cultures that went down there, because we're talking about, hundreds of years potentially, they could have not come back out.
So they all died, you think?
Well, I mean, it's not like all the people on Earth died or we wouldn't be here.
Right.
But I think, like, look at today. Don't we have places in the world, like in the Amazon or remote islands off of India and Africa, where there are people that live so primitive that they're literally closed off to the outside world, right? They're living completely in harmony with the nature. They have no technology, Papua New Guinea and other places. They have no connection to this technological world like we do, right?
Yep.
But we're living in the same world as they are, right? The same time period. I think it was much the same in the ancient world. Is that there were indigenous groups around the world at that time that were living in pockets that didn't get nearly as affected. Give you an example, like parts of Africa in the Amazon didn't seem to have the same effects from these climatic events that other areas did.
So they didn't get hit with the ice age in Africa?
And just other things like massive tsunamis, huge CME events. It wasn't across the whole earth in like an even way. When we had these magnetic incursions and shifts on the poles, it looks like parts of the earth got a lot more affected than others.
Makes sense.
Like I'll give you an example. What are called megafauna are large mammals, right? If you look around the earth, most of the megafauna that are still here, like Randall Carlson talks about, are mostly in Africa. During the last ice age, during the Pleistocene, most of the large megafauna in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere all went extinct. It's estimated that 44 million megafauna, like woolly mammoths and mastodons and, saber-toothed tigers, maybe saber-toothed cats. Remember all these creatures, dire wolves, right? They were all real creatures that existed around the world that were wiped out at the same exact time period. That all the evidence is showing that the ancient civilizations and the temples and the blocks were all destroyed and scattered everywhere, and that the cultures that lived there were wiped out.
Wow.
So we're looking at, ice cores and climatic data is lining up with the disappearance of this lost civilization around the world with the destruction of the megafauna all across the world as well, in the northern and southern hemisphere. I'll give you an example. In the early 1900s, there was a whole group that was exploring the New Siberian Islands up in above Siberia in Canada, and they found a 25-foot alder tree that had green leaves that had been flash frozen, 25 feet tall. Okay. Guess what though? It's hundreds of miles north of where any trees can grow. Okay. At the same time, in the area of the New Siberian Islands, they found mammoths that were completely frozen as well, in a state of basically preserving with food, undigested food still in their throats and stomachs. Now, it's kind of funny, but Purdue, of all companies, is the one who ended up doing a study because they freeze food, right?
Yeah.
They did a study on these mastodons, and they had to determine how that could have happened without them putrefying, like rotting.
Yeah.
And what they determined is that the mastodons had to have been frozen at negative 150 degrees Fahrenheit.
Whoa.
So today, the coldest temperature that's ever been recorded in modern history is like 127 degrees below zero in Antarctica. Okay? It means that during this time period that those megafauna disappeared around the earth. We also had this massive flash freeze across the northern hemisphere that froze the hardiest megafauna animals on earth instantly. Now, remember what I said, the 25-foot alder tree with the green leaves? Not only did that tree grow where it's not supposed to be, and I'll tell you why in a second, but it froze instantly as well. The reason I say that is that ice cores from Greenland show that before this flash freeze of the Younger Dryas, there's a time period called the Older Dryas at 14,500 years ago that had a spike in temperatures on the Earth where it was like warmer than it is now, okay? That seems to be the event that caused a massive melting of the last ice age. So you have this tree growing where it's not supposed to be because the Earth rapidly got very, very, very warm, okay? So mammoths are living up there. There's things growing, and then instantly plummets. Instantly plummets at 12,800 years ago. The temperatures plummet colder than even the last ice age, which aligns with exactly what I was saying about them finding that the temperatures looked like they all of a sudden plummeted to negative 150 below zero.
That's so cool. That's so cold. Holy crap.
Just like instantly though, Sean.
So do you think that's why those guys went underground then?
That's the same time period that we're seeing geologic evidence that the lost civilizations were dealing with the same thing, that they were going through those events and having to go underground to survive these absolutely catastrophic end of the world events around the world. But it went on for so long, again, 1,500 years off and on.
Dang, it was that cold for 1,500
Well, no, it was like a seesaw.
Oh, okay.
So imagine these different periods where you have these very, very significant events at different intervals, but between you still have a crazy unbalanced climate. But on either end of it, you have these devastating events. So even if you survive like hundreds of years into it, then you try to go back out or something and you just get wiped out again. That's why I think humanity went through a complete reset of its civilization, because those ancient civilizations, some of the rebuilders, we'll call them, tried to restart humanity, but they didn't make it. We forgot everything. We start over again. And the knowledge that's left is in these small ancient temples and areas that survived, that were buried and protected, right? There's evidence that Göbekli Tepe was buried and concealed as well. Like they knew that it had to survive to another time, or humanity wouldn't remember anything about who they are.
Insane.
And here we are now, finally at this time period where all these esoteric and ancient mysteries are coming back to life.
Yeah.
And we're all of a sudden remembering who we once were and all that we knew. And we're rebuilding the pieces of what they call like the new Atlantis, right? The new golden age.
Yeah, it feels like we're putting the pieces back together this time around, right?
Exactly.
Hopefully there's not another reset anytime soon.
I think humanity may have something that they didn't have, though, is that as smart as they were and as deeply connected as they were, building these incredible structures that may have been helping to try to balance the earth, the magnetosphere of the earth, we may have certain technologies that they didn't have.
Like AI?
No, like different weather modification and different things like Nikola Tesla type of magnetic technology, using free energy that I believe may be secretly being used to help prevent this next cycle that we're in right now. Remember I said the great year. So the great year is 25,800 years, okay? It's the cycle of the entire pivot of the earth through different constellations, okay? Half of that great year is about 12,000 years, okay? 12,000 would change. We're in that exact cycle right now. Those disasters I just mentioned about them having to go underground and the megafauna being destroyed during the Younger Dryas, that's just a little over 12,000 years ago. So we're in that cycle again right now.
That's why you're probably seeing a lot of solar flares, right?
That's exactly why we're seeing this activity again. We're having another repeat of the same types of events. However, I think that we may have things that we can do that they didn't have. A lot of people are going to come on that talk about this. They're going to be doom and gloom, saying like, oh, we're going to be wiped out. I believe that we have the mechanisms and the means to prevent our own destruction, potentially for the first time ever in our history.
That's exciting. Yeah, because there wasn't any evidence that we could travel into space before, right?
Well, not even leaving the planet, being able to somehow balance things like magnetic incursions of our planet, which are happening right now. There's been a magnetic incursion happening at the magnetic North Pole for the last 20 plus years. That's why they've had to go back and fly up to get new readings, because it has to do with all of our instruments that we use for navigation. Like I'll give you an example. The ancient Inuit culture of northern Canada has used the stars for hunting for thousands of years. And elders had come forth throughout the 90s and told people that they can no longer follow the stars to navigate, like because the North Star is no longer, things are no longer in the same place any longer. Because our magnetic North Pole is changing, it no longer allows the same navigation. It's that magnetic incursion is already occurring.
Wow, it's that like noticeable? Like you can't even hunt now, or?
Yeah, because the stars have shifted in the sky because our Earth has shifted.
Wow.
And so that's just an indication that we're going through one of these cycles. But at the same time, it's like the Earth gets blasted with this increased energy of the sun and helps lead to conscious shifts and these huge leaps in humanity. It's all part of the cycle, Sean.
It's crazy to zoom out and look at life that way, you know?
Well, yeah, we're just playing roles within something greater.
Yeah.
So this is that's why I say this is one of the greatest times you can ever live in humanity. All the mysteries and all the secrets are all coming to light. We have an interconnected world. Like right now, we're talking through this digital means that is going to reach, potentially millions around the world. We didn't have that ability before.
That's true.
Now we have the ability to spread knowledge and to connect people in a way we never had. because we're just like we're like a global collective.
Yeah, and you get to meet with the brightest minds and collab with them. I know you work with Billy Carson, Robert Edward Grant, and a lot of top, people in the world. So
yeah, we get to do something that has potentially not happened before. I mean, right now I am working to lead a documentary with, again, top experts around the world. Robert Schoch, Robert Edward Grant, Hans Orheim, the archaeologist, Paul Wallace, Lydia de Leon, Arturo Ponce de Leon. These are all geobiologists, geologists, archaeologists, polymaths, sacred geometry experts. We're bringing the top experts in the world to look at all of these sites. Again, like I mentioned, all around Lake Vaughn, the underwater ruins, these giant, incredible megaliths and artifacts, and going and connecting to things like Peru and Bolivia with the same artifacts, the types of designs, the same motifs and symbols. Places like Egypt, places like Menorca, Spain, that all have the same T-pillars, the same type of triptych doorway, the same type of crosses. It's like this, it's not like a primitive type of knowledge. It's like an interconnected ancient knowledge, like almost Atlantean knowledge that was passed around the world, that's waiting for this time when humanity can realize that the language that the ancients spoke wasn't written down. It was through symbols.
Yeah. And these symbols were everywhere. So they were definitely communicating back then in some way.
That was how they were preserving to leave behind their messages, because symbols are difficult to interpret and understand unless you have a certain mindset. And the reason they would do that is that, I'll give you an example. The reason why Socrates didn't want to write anything down, it was that he believed that it could be misinterpreted. And so that is why he didn't. Plato learned everything he knew from Socrates, and then he wrote it down. But the idea with the ancient mystery schools, they call them, was that certain knowledge was too powerful for the average person to have. And so what they did is they hid it within symbols and motifs so that only the initiates and those who were studied could understand what they meant.
Wow.
Because to regular people, it wouldn't make any sense to them. So it was a way of protecting these messages for groups and civilizations that had reached a certain consciousness where all of a sudden the veil could be lifted and they could understand the ancient knowledge that connected everything.
That's fascinating. They say that about numerology too, how all the numbers are just in plain sight, but you got to interpret them.
Well, that's the way, because our universe is built on geometry and mathematics, that there's a design woven into all of it. That once we can discover that, we can be like gods, because we can realize the connection and the pattern that exists in all things, right? With the flower of life. The flower of life symbol is a mathematical geometric shape that connects literally everything in the universe. And right now, the underwater ruins that we're exploring that have all these connections, that flower of life symbol is on those stones.
Wow.
Encompassed on those stones to survive the test of time. And I'm happy to show you a picture to put up of this to show that.
Yeah, we'll throw it up.
Think about it. If you have underwater ruins that are 75 feet underwater, that would have meant that the levels of that lake would have had to have been over 80 feet lower to be able to create those structures in the first place. And so we're exploring into the evidence to prove how old some of these civilizations may be because of some of this scientific evidence of when things like water levels raised and how they raised. So we're finally bringing evidence, Sean, because you can't date stone. We're bringing evidence from things like vitrification evidence, combining with climatic evidence, and things like the underwater ruins and sediment cores to be able to bring real science in to prove once and for all that we have an entire lost chapter of our history that's been forgotten, to try to piece together again so that history books can talk about this legacy of what we once were.
That's beautiful. You're going to rewrite some books, my man. I can't wait to see it. And where can people watch your stuff?
Please check out my website, thestageoftime.com. You can see all the information about the upcoming documentary, where, again, we're going to be filming, where we've done numerous scouting trips, and we're planning everything to be filming this coming year and then into 2025 for basically these areas of Turkey, Menorca, Spain, Peru, and Bolivia to connect the lost narrative around the world, to bring people on this ancient mystery, to explore all the evidence from this lost civilization or civilizations that so many other people like you talk to are helping bring to light the evidence to truly show us everything that we've forgotten and what we're missing.
Perfect. We'll link it below. Thanks so much, man. We'll talk after your trip.
Thanks, Sean. It's good talking to you, my friend.
Awesome. Peace. See you guys.